Good evening. Hope all of you are doing well. We are learning Maseches Yevamos daf Nun Aleph, and we're starting on the last two words of Nun Amud Beis. We just started a new parak Rabban Gamliel, and I'll just repeat the framing of this parak because it's important to note that when it comes to separating a marriage, we have both chalitza and get, and when it comes to marriage, we have maimer and kedushin. Now, maimer and get, as it relates to a yevama, are both derabanan, and chalitza and yibum, as it relates to a yevama, are both deoraisa. So these are going to be the critical pillars of this sugya to understand them clearly. We need to remember that chalitza and yibum are deoraisa, and maimer and get are derabanan. With that said, we had learned the machlokas Rabban Gamliel and the Chachamim, and that's really what we're going to be analyzing today. So on the bottom two words of Nun Amud Beis, the Gemara says, Omar Rava, my time of the Rabban Gamliel. What is the reason for the shita of Rabban Gamliel? Rashi, very nice of him, provides us with a chazara of his shita. Rashi, top of Nun Aleph, Amud Aleph, Dibur Hamaschel, my time of the Rabban Gamliel. My time of the Rabban Gamliel, de Amar, ein get achar get, b'shtei Yevamos, o b'shnei Yevamin. Why is it that if there are two women who could potentially receive a get, why is it that after you give the first one, the second one is a zero? Why is that the case? Ein get achar get. Similarly, in the language of Shabbos, ein bishul achar bishul. You can't do the violation twice. You can't do the get twice. Once the get has been given to one of the Yevamos, it's a zero to the other one. And Rashi finishes off with the nafkamina, de lo mitzar basra bekrovoseha. And the second woman who received that second get, she's not a grusha, and therefore we can marry her relatives. Otherwise, the relatives of the grusha would have been problematic. So says the Gemara, what's the rationale behind the sheet of Rabban Gamliel? And the Gemara answers, top line of Nun Aleph Amud Aleph, the misafkale get idachi ilo dachi, because Rabban Gamliel has a suffix as to whether or not a get is effective with the yevama. Remember, it's not chalitza, it's a get. Is a get effective with the yevama? Is it dachi or is it lo dachi? And also in regards to maimer, which is kedushim derabanan, ikani ilo kani. This is his suffix. And how does he paint the picture of his suffix? So the Gemara articulates in detail how it works. Get idachi ilo dachi. What was the suffix of Rabban Gamliel in such a case? Well, he says as follows: ikama dachi. If the get actually does sever the zika tie with the first yevama, then basra mai ka'avid. Then zika's over. Then there's no point of the second one. And ikama lo dachi, if the get is not effective for a yevama, for the first yevama, then basar nami lo dachi. So this is why he says, like, I don't understand like what the model is, like how are we supposed to use it? It doesn't seem to be effective. It's a suffix, and therefore he holds ein get achar get. And in regards to maimer as well, 4 lines down, maimer ikani ilo kani. What was his element of doubt there? Well, he says ikama kani. Had it been that maimer with the first yevama was kona, then basra maikavi, then fine, he's allowed to marry that one. And what's the point of doing maimer again? You already married the first one. But had it been that maimer did not work with the first of the two yevamos, then basra nami lokani, then with the second spouse as well, then the maimer should not work. So this is how Rava paints the picture of Abaye, that the reason why we are where we are of holding ein get achar get and ein maimer achar maimer in our Mishnah, the Mishnah that opened the parak on daf Nun Amud Aleph, is because misafkale, the Rabban Gamliel has an element of suffix. Abaye is not buying shitas Rava. He says Rabban Gamliel has no suffix. Esvei Abaye, he says as follows. The Brisa says a couple of things that Rabban Gamliel admits to. Umode Rabban Gamliel sheyesh get achar maimer. Remember that Rabban Gamliel normally holds ein get achar get, but he admits, he's modeh, that yesh get achar maimer, that if there's maimer first, then a get does work. He also holds umaimer achar haget, that maimer works if it's after a get. And this is the part that's important for Abaye's argument, he also holds the get achar bia umaimer. Let's say there are 3 yevamos. One he was intimate with and he married her. The second he did maimer with, and then the third one he gave a get to. And then as well, umaimer achar bia the get. If there was maimer after the first 2 of the 3 yevamos had bia followed by a get, and then there was maimer. So he says that in those cases, that's what the Brisa says. But in those cases, that doesn't paint a picture of Rabban Gamliel being besafik. V'imesafkale the Rabban Gamliel. Had it been that Rabban Gamliel was mesupak as to the power of get and the power of of Maimer, then Tehavi Kibia Delechatchila Betikni. Then we should have looked only at the Tashma Shamita that took case in the case of the 3 Yevamos. That's what we should have looked at and ignored the cases that were Besafik, namely the cases of Maimer and Get. The Hatnan, what did we learn about Bia? Habi'ila Bizmachi Betchila Ein Achareha Klum. That the Be'ila, the Tashma Shamita that generates Yibum, once that takes place, then nothing else can take place after that. There's no suffix there. So it can't be that Rava that is correct. Rava said that Rabban Gamliel holds that there's a suffix by Maimer and Get, but then the Gemara says in the name of Abaye, that's not true because the Brisa shows that even Rabban Gamliel holds that there's no suffix in those cases. Ella, therefore, a quarter of the way down on Nun Aleph Amud Aleph, Ella Amar Abaye, Rava's wrong. How then do we understand the Shita of Rabban Gamliel in our Mishnah, who holds Ein Get Achar Get and Ein Maimer Achar Maimer? Says the Gemara, Ella Amar Abaye, Le'olam really Shitas Rabban Gamliel is Pshita Leila Rabban Gamliel beget the dachi u'maimer dekani. He for sure agrees that a get is effective and that maimer is going to be effective as well. A get will create a severing of the zika, and maimer solidifies the zika. Mihu Amarabanan, the rabbis have taught us Hayavama bechad sad mahani baget ubechad sad mahani b'maimer. That when it yes, maimer works and get works. However, the woman herself has a dichotomous reality to her in that part of her is subject to Gittin in that she's a female, she's a regular woman, and part of her is subject to Maimer because in theory she could be married. So it's almost like it's almost kind of like Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin in a way where we see different elements of her, and therefore it definitely works. And Get Achar Get Lo Dachi, why is it that Rabban Gamliel holds that Get Achar Get doesn't work? Because Tehadacha Le Kama. Because once you divorce the first woman, there's nothing left to be said about it, and therefore in Get Achar Get. What about Maimer? Maimer achar Maimer lo kani dehakani lekama, for the same svara. That when the first Yevama has Maimer, she has now been kone to the Yavam, and therefore the Maimer to the second woman is not relevant. What about Get Achar Maimer Maimer Achar Get? So says the Gemara, there too, Hai Milsa Kadachi, V'Hai Milsa Kakani. She has, as mentioned, that when you do Get Achar Maimer, there Rabban Gamliel is moded that there is one after the other, that they are effective. And that's because a woman has these two dichotomous components to her that would enable her to be halachically engaged. What do the rabbis do about this? The Chachamim who argue against Rabban Gamliel. Says the Gemara halfway down, V'Rabbanan, what do they do? So says the Gemara, when it comes to Maimer and Get, the Yavam has full power to do Get and Maimer multiple times from one Yavama to the next. What's the language of the Gemara that represents this? Kol chad v'chad, for every Yavam, takinu le Rabbanan Get u'Maimer b'Yavama. He is allowed without any restrictions to do one Get for one woman and then another Get for another woman, and that is how he holds. Underlying all of this is a discussion, of course, of Zika. So what is going on here? It seems to be that the Rabbanan were of the opinion that that the Zika is not totally severed in the first Get, because if it was, then you couldn't do the second Get. So the Chachamim are still holding on. The Rishonim write this here. The Chachamim are still holding on to a little bit of Zika. Masha'ain came when it comes to the sheet of the Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel says, no, Ein Get Achar Get. Once you do the Get, severed, done, and therefore the other woman is not subject to Gittin. So that's really the underlying machlokas Rabban Gamliel and the Chachamim, is whether or not we say Zika, and we'll see more of this at the bottom of the page. Now, going back to the Shita of Rabban Gamliel, and Rashi highlights this for us, that we're going back to Rabban Gamliel, that Rabban Gamliel spoke about this idea of Bia Psula. Bia Psula is when there's Tashmish Amita after Maimer, after Gittin. After a get or chalitza, the bia is an ineffective bia because there was something that preceded it that was confusing. If there was a get, then she should be divorced. Why is there tashma shamita? So this is called bia psula. Says the Gemara, "V'hai bia psula." This has two sides to the coin, and in one way, adifa mi maimer. It's actually more powerful than maimer, and ugriya mi maimer. It's also weaker than maimer. So we're talking about bia psula, this non-ideal version of tashma shamita. Let's explain each side of the coin. Adifa mi maimer. Why is bia psula better than maimer? Says the Gemara, the ilu maimer achar maimer lo mahani. That when it comes to maimer achar maimer, Rabban Gamliel holds that it doesn't help. The ilu bia achar maimer mahani. However, tashma shamita after maimer. If there's Tashma Shemitah after Maimer, that's called Yibum. That's a classical case of Yibum. And that's why it's stronger in some way than Yibum. However, Ugriya mi Maimer, Bia Psula, is in a way weaker than Maimer. How so? Di'ilu Maimer achar haget, kani lekule shiur de get, that Maimer after a get they are basically remarried at that point. But if there's tashmish amita after a get, lo kanya le'lekul shiur the get. That does not rekindle the marriage. The bia after the get is a very confusing halacha, and that should not be done. So that's what the Gemara says is one of the weaknesses of bia psula relative to mimer. And that brings us to a new brisa. This new brisa will carry us all the way to the bottom of the page with one other sugya attached at the bottom, all the way to the last line of Nun Aleph Amud Beis. Let's continue. The brisa says 2/3 of the way down on Nun Aleph Amud Aleph. Tanu Rabbanan. Ketzad Amar Rabban Gamliel ein get achar get. What is the scenario in which our Mishnah at the opening of the perek highlights this shita of Rabban Gamliel of ein get achar get? Says the Gemara, the case is like this. Shtei Yevamos. So Reuven had two wives, Chana and Penina, and Reuven died, and Chana and Penina fell b'yibum to Shimon. Shenaflu liyavam echad. So Chana and Penina fall b'yibum to Shimon. The Nasan get lezu v'get lezu, and he gave a get to each woman, one to Chana and one to Penina. Rabban Gamliel Omer choletz l'rishona. You have to do chalitza to one of the women. The aser b'krovoseha, and to the woman to whom you do chalitza, she's your chalutza, and therefore you cannot marry her relatives. Umutter b'krovos shniya, because what does he hold? He holds ein get achar get. That's the shitaso. And therefore, because you did the get to the first person, so she's asura to you. She's your grusha or your chalutza in this case. And the second woman, you can marry her relatives without a problem. She's not a grusha because ein get achar get. If you do get achar get, the chachamim say yesh get achar get. That if you give a get to one woman, to one yevama, you can also still give a get to the second person, and both of them are your grusha, and therefore you're usher in the relatives of both of them. So again, the chachamim, you're going to see the pattern yet again, that the chachamim hold that the zika is not yet gone, because if you can still do zika on the second wife, you still have some type of bond to her that requires a get. But the Rabban Gamliel doesn't hold that way. Rabban Gamliel holds ein get achar get, and therefore you can marry the relatives of the second wife. And the Mishnah, the Brisa here adds, not only is it true when there is two Yevamos and one Yavam, it's also true when there's two Yevamim and one Yevama, meaning one brother would give her a get and another brother would give her a get. That applies there. We're not going to go through this case in full color, but that is what the Mishnah says. And what about the second case mentioned in our original Mishnah? Ketzad Amar Rabban Gamliel ein maimer achar maimer. What is the case scenario where Rabban Gamliel says ein maimer achar maimer, that if you did maimer to one of the women, that your subsequent maimer to the other Yevama is irrelevant? Says the Gemara, last of the short lines on Nun Aleph Amud Aleph, Shtei Yevamos shenaflu lifnei Yavam echad. Two Yevamos, Chana and Penina, they fall to Shimon b'yibum. Lifnei Yavam echad. The asa maimer bezu maimer bezu. And then Shimon does maimer both to Chana and to Penina. Says Rabban Gamliel Omer, no saying get l'rishona v'choletzla. You did maimer to the first woman, so let's say Chana. So you have to go over to Chana, you have to give her a get and do chalitza. The aser b'krovoseha, and to Chana, you're not allowed to marry her relative. She's your chalutza, she's your grusha. But umutter b'krovoshniya lishitaso, as we assume, this is all Rabban Gamliel, because there's still all the zika is gone now, and therefore the second woman has no shaychus to you whatsoever. The chachamim omrim, what did the chachamim say? Again, following the party line that there is still some zika here. No saying get l'shtehen. If you give a get to both, you're going to need to give a get to both women who received maimer. The aser b'krovoshteen. And you're not allowed to marry any of the relatives of either of them because there's still zika. So then if you did maimer to one, you can still do maimer to the other. And therefore, you have to divorce both of them, and you still need to do one chalitza to free them up to marry other people. And similarly, just like this case of ein maimer achar maimer is true with two yavamos and one yavam, so too with two brothers. Let's say that that Reuven was married to one person, only to Rachel, and then she fell b'yibum to Ruth, Shimon, and Levi. So there too, the halachos would be the same. Now let's analyze this brisa in a couple of different ways. 4 lines from the bottom. Amar Mar. What did we just see in this brisa? We said no saying get lezu v'get lezu, that we had this machlokes between Rabban Gamliel. What was Rabban Gamliel's shita? That if a man gave a get to Chana and a man gave a get to Penina, both of whom are his Yevama, Rabban Gamliel Omer choletz l'rishon of aser b'krovoseha u'mutter b'krovashniya. Like we said, that he's obligated to give chalitza to one of them, and he cannot marry that woman's relatives, but he's able to marry the second woman's relatives because the zika is gone, and therefore the get is not shaykh by that person. So says the Gemara, this should be a rejection of the shita of Shmuel. Leima tehabe tiyuv to the Shmuel. What does Shmuel say? The Amar Shmuel chalatz labaylas haget lo nifterat tzara. What does Rabban Gamliel hold? Rabban Gamliel holds that if you give a get to one woman, the other person doesn't need anything because the zika is severed with the first wife. Once he does get with the first wife, their whole relationship is over for both Yevamos. So says the Gemara, Shmuel, you have a big problem because Rabban Gamliel don't seem to agree with you. Because what you just said is when there is chalitza for the bailas haget, that the other wife, Penina, is still stuck with you. And that's not what Rabban Gamliel says. It says the Gemara, no. Amar lach Shmuel, ki amre ana. When did I say my opinion that lo niftarat tzara? That's aliba demand to Amar yesh zika. That's only according to the opinion of the person who says yesh zika. But the Rabban Gamliel savar ein zika. Rabban Gamliel holds that there is no tethering. So you're right. According to Rabban Gamliel, there's no reason for the tzara to still be connected. All the zika is gone. Masha'en Kain, Shmuel was speaking within the framework of yesh zika, which would have been the sheet of the Chachamim. Says the Gemara Adiuk on the very bottom of Nun Aleph Amud Aleph. If what you just said is true, Shmuel, Rabban Gamliel savar ein zika, turning to the top of Nun Aleph Amud Beis. If in fact it's true that Rabban Gamliel holds that there's ein zika, which is how we've been understanding our Gemara on the Amud Aleph, so then that implies Rabbanan savre yesh zika. That implies that the Rabbanan are of the opinion that there is zika. However, says the Gemara, that's difficult to say because what does our brisa say? V'ktani seifa, we said in our brisa on the bottom of Nun Aleph Amud Aleph, it says v'chein ata omer b'shnei yevamin v'yevama achas. That this is also true with two men who are brothers who share a yevama. Rashi, 3 lines down, Dibra Hamaschal v'katani seifa v'chein ata omer b'shnei yevama. Rashi says, Di'im nasnu shnehem get. If both Shimon and Levi give a get to Rachel, choletz la echad mehem. You have to do chalitza to one of them. Ve'afilu the Rabbanan, even according to the Rabbanan, de'amre yesh zika, even according to them who hold yesh zika, in this case, sagila b'ha chalitza ru'ua dechad minayu. They don't both have to do zika. So how can the Rabbanan say yesh zika, but only require chalitza for one of the men who gave the get? That doesn't make any sense. So therefore, says the Gemara, absolutely true. And leima tehabe tiyufta de Rabba bar Rav Huna amar Rav. Maybe this rejects the shita of Rav. What does Rav say? To amar Rabba bar Rav Huna amar Rav chalitza psula. If you have a chalitza psula, remember we said a chalitza psula throughout this Masechta means when you have an opportunity to do chalitza when yibum is not allowed. So the chalitza works, but it's when there is no yibum allowed. Okay, so in such a case, chalitza psula tzricha lachzor al kol ha'achin. So that would be, this shita doesn't say you have to be a choser al kol ha'achin. It says you only need to give one chalitza, but not to all the brothers. So this should be a rejection of Rav. Amar lach Rabba bar Rav Huna amar Rav, he says no. Bein l'Rabban Gamliel, bein l'Rabbanan, whether or not you hold like Rabban Gamliel or the Rabbanan, savre, everybody holds ein zika. Oh, so if everybody holds ein zika, then how do we understand the sheets of the Chachamim? The Hacha beget achar get umaimer achar maimer kimiflagi. They're only discussing a narrow case of get achar get and maimer achar maimer, and not the more convoluted cases of maimer achar get and get achar maimer. Another piece of analysis from this brisa that we learned on the bottom of Nun Aleph Amud Aleph says the Gemara Amar Mar Asa maimer bezu umaimer bezu. We had said in our brisa that if Shimon, if we're talking about a case of one brother and 2 Yevamos, if Shimon did Maimer to Chana and if Shimon did Maimer to Penina, then what did Rabban Gamliel say? Rabban Gamliel Omer, no saying get l'rishona, you have to give a get to one person, v'choletzla, and she needs chalitza, and then for her, v'asher b'krovo seha, but mutter b'krovo shnia. This is the 3rd time we've seen this, that Rabban Gamliel is of the opinion of ein maimer achar maimer. If you do a maimer to Chana and a maimer to Penina, you only need to sever the maimer with Chana, and then Penina is free to go because the maimer with her is irrelevant. So it says the Gemara Mechli, let's analyze this shita. Kasava Rabban Gamliel ein maimer achar maimer. Rabban Gamliel was of the opinion that you cannot do anything after the maimer. So why not? Why don't we say Rishona Name Tisyabe? Why don't we say he should do Yibum with the first one? You're just saying he has to do Chalitza. Why can't he do Yibum? So here's the case scenario. Reuven has 2 wives, Chana and Penina. Reuven dies. Chana and Penina fall to Shimon. He does Maimer with both wives. So we say you have to do Chalitza. Why can't you do Yibum? She had Maimer. Maimer plus Yibum is a perfect combination of the mitzvah d'oraisa of Yibum. Why don't we allow The mitzvah d'oraisa of Yibum, if you've given mimer to both wives, you're right, the second one shouldn't have happened, the second mimer shouldn't have happened, but let me marry the first woman. If Chana had mimer, followed by Penina, don't tell me I can only do chalitza. I can marry Chana. Let me do Yibum. So it says the Gemara, you're not allowed. Gzeira, dilma asi li yibume lishniya. We're concerned that you might make an error and marry the second woman. There are similarities of this in halacha. For example, we don't use a shofar on Rosh Hashanah, which falls out on Shabbos, gzeira, rabbinic conjunction, because you might carry. We don't allow riding an animal on Shabbos, gzeira, you might break off a stick. All the gzeiras that we have, laning Megillah on Shabbos. We don't lane Megillah because Shemi Avrim Abraham Shrizarabim. This is the same thing. We have a possible mitzvah d'oraisa here. Chana had mimer. Why can't I marry Chana? What's the problem? The Gemara says nothing. Not with her. We're concerned that if there's two Yevamos, you might accidentally marry the second one, and that's an Isser D'oraisa. So out of concern for the error of marrying Mimer wife number 2, Penina, you cannot even marry Mimer, even though it's Mitzvah D'oraisa. So this is a big din in Rishonim, not here, but elsewhere in Shas. How do you uproot a din D'oraisa? So you can only uproot a din D'oraisa b'sheva al taset. So we don't put on tefillin on the second day of Yontif here in America. Everybody knows, midoraisa, you have a mitzvah to put on tefillin. For sure. Why don't we put? Because it's the Chachamim have the power to be docha and asay Shabbat Torah b'sheva al tasa. So that's what's happening here too. Really, Yibum should take place, but we don't allow it out of concern for a secondary concern, not even a primary concern, just a secondary concern. The rest of the Gemara is pretty rapid. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabban Gamliel, Ube Shammai, Reb Shimon, Uben Azai, Rab Nechemya, Kul Hu Svira Lahu Maimer Kona Kinyan Gamur. That mimer is a kinyan gamur. It says midorais or derabanan. The Gemara doesn't distinguish. But let's see what each of these shitas are. Rabban Gamliel hada amran. That is what we've seen already, because he says ein mimer achar mimer. If ein mimer achar mimer, that means the first mimer was real and the second mimer is irrelevant, which means mimer is a kinyan gamur. That's Rabban Gamliel. What about Beis Shammai? Halfway down, the Gemara quotes a Mishnah. That's not. Shlosha achin, 3 brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Shnai mehen nesuin l'shtei achayos. Reuven and Shimon are married to sisters Rachel and Shoshana. And the echad mufne, Levi is not married at all. Meis echad mibale achayos. Reuven dies and leaves Rachel. The asaba mufne maimer. And Levi, the third brother, does maimer to Rachel, his oldest brother's widow. The achar kach, and then Shimon dies. Meis achi basheni. So now Rachel fell to him b'yibum first, and he did mimer. Subsequently, Shimon died, and Shoshana fell to him b'yibum. Now what? Beis Shammai Omer. What's Beis Shammai shita? Ishto imo. The first woman, Rachel, who Levi did mimer to Rachel, they're married. They have to stay there. V'halazu, Shoshana, who was Shimon's wife after Shimon died, teitze mishum achos isha. No. By virtue of the fact that we refer to Shimon's wife Shoshana as Achos Ishto, that shows you that the initial mimer was a kinyan gamur. So this is where we see Beis Shammai shita, that mimer is a kinyan gamur. Third shita, Reb Shimon. We are 2/3 of the way down in Aleph from the base, heading to the bottom of the page. The Tanya, the Brisa writes, Amar luhu Reb Shimon lechachamim, im bias rishon bia. If one has tashma shemita with the first of the Yevamos, then bia shnia eino bia. Then the second one's irrelevant. The first woman is your Yevama. You were intimate with her, she's your Yevama. You were intimate with the second one, you're a Rasha. That's not right. You're not supposed to do that. She's your sister-in-law. That's not allowed. And in bias rishon eino bia, if the first tashma shemita was not halachically valid, then bia sheni nami eino bia. Then the tashma shemita there was not relevant. Now, here's where the knech comes in. V'habias ben tesha. When a child is at least 9 years and 1 day old, and he is intimate with a Yevama, we treat that like mimer. The Ka'amar Reb Shimon ein a bia. And if this child who's 9 years and 1 day old is intimate with his Yevama, that one is Kona, the first wife is Kona, and the second one is ein a bia. What does that show you about the kinyan of the child's bia? That it is Kona. And we said that child's bia is kimaimer. So therefore we see that the sheet of Reb Shimon also holds that mimer is a kinyan gamor. What about Ben Azai? We're going to learn about Ben Azai and Reb Nechemya, and then we're going to call it a day. Ben Azai says to Tanya, Ben Azai Omer, Yesh mimer achar mimer, b'shnei yevamin v'yevama achas. We do say that the second mimer is valid if you have 2 brothers who are Yevamim, and there is one woman to whom she fell b'yibum. So what does that mean? That means Reuven's married to Rachel, and Shimon and Levi are the brothers. Reuven dies, Rachel falls to Shimon and Levi. There are two Yevamim, and there's only one Yevama. In that case, Yesh Maimer Achar Maimer. But here's the part that we need for Ben Azai. The Ein Maimer Achar Maimer b'shtei Yevamos b'Yavamecha. But if there's two women, Chana and Penina, who fall to Shimon, in that case, what do we say? Ein Maimer Achar Maimer, which goes to show you yet again that Maimer is Kone a Kinyan Gomer. Last shita for the night, Reb Nechemya. Ditnan, what does the Mishnah say about Rav Nechemya? Rav Nechemya Omer, achas be'ila ve'achas chalitza. Whether or not the act that took place between a Yavam and a Yavama was tashma shamita or chalitza, bein betchila, bein be'emsa, bein besof. And with either of these activities, it could have been the first, second, or third of the halachic potential activities you could have done. Halacha, ein acharei klum. I says the Gemara, beha bia psula. When it comes to bia psula, which is when it's done out of order after get or mimer, then that's the kemaimer shavyu rabbanan. Yet what do we see? The katani in acharei klum. We said that even if the bia follows get or mimer, that it doesn't count. And that's considered like a mimer. That's what it says, that bia psula is kemaimer. And what do we see? In acharei klum, we see that bia psula, which is similar to a mimer, is the end of the conversation in acharei klum, which goes to show you yet again, for I think the fifth shita, what is it, Rabban Gamliel, Beis Shammai, Reb Shimon, Ben Azai, and Reb Nechemya, the fifth shita in a row that holds that mimer is kone a kinyan gomer. We'll stop right here. Mir Hashem will pick up tomorrow night on the very bottom of Nanalef Amud Beis. Wishing you all a beautiful night.